Mother and son walk down the street. 70 years later, researchers look and can't believe their eyes. In the spring of 1954, in the small town of Millfield, Ohio, local newspaper photographer Frank Patterson was preparing to document daily life in post-war America. The crisp April air carried the scent of fresh grass and the hopeful spirit of economic prosperity. Frank adjusted his camera, a new Canon he had recently purchased, when his gaze settled on a simple scene. A young woman, around 30 years old, was walking down Main Street holding her son's hand. Margaret Thompson wore a navy blue dress and a light spring coat, while her 7-year-old boy, David, skipped cheerfully beside her. It was a perfect image for the local newspaper, The Ideal American. Family enjoying a peaceful afternoon in their thriving hometown, Frank aimed his lens at them, calculating the perfect afternoon light. In the background, downtown Millfield bustled with its usual activity: shopkeepers arranging storefront displays, children playing near the park fountain, elderly folks chatting on benches. Everything seemed perfectly normal, almost idyllic for that optimistic era. But if Frank had looked more carefully through his viewfinder, he might have noticed something unusual in Margaret's expression, a subtle tension, a vigilance that didn't match the apparent tranquility of the moment. There was an alertness in her green eyes. The hand holding her son's trembled almost imperceptibly. With a satisfied click, Frank captured the moment. Margaret and David continued walking, completely unaware they had just become part of history. The photograph was filed away in the newspaper archives alongside hundreds of others, documenting an era that seemed peaceful, but concealed dangerous secrets. At that moment, no one could have suspected that this apparently mundane image would reveal. 7 decades later, story that would shock the entire community of historical researchers across America. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian specializing in Cold War America, was in her office at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. On a foggy November morning in 2024, before her lay hundreds of digitized photographs from small-town newspapers across the Midwest, part of an ambitious project to preserve America's post-war historical memory. The work was meticulous and often monotonous, but Sarah was passionate about uncovering forgotten stories from America's past. Outside, late autumn rain tapped against the windows of the prestigious institution, creating the perfect atmosphere for deep research. When she opened the Ohio Small Towns 1950 to 1960 digital collection, one photograph immediately caught her attention. It was the image of Margaret and David, now scanned in ultra-high resolution. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical family scene from 1950s America. But something in Margaret's demeanor troubled Sarah. The woman wasn't looking straight ahead with the carefree expression typical of the era. Instead, her head was slightly turned to the right, as if she were watching someone or something outside the frame. There was a subtle tension in her posture that seemed out of place for such an ordinary moment. Intrigued, Sarah enlarged the image on her state-of-the-art computer monitor. Modern digital technology allowed incredible detail enhancement that would have been impossible decades earlier. As she carefully examined every corner of the photograph, progressively increasing the magnification, her breath suddenly caught in the background. Near the entrance to Henderson's bookstore, a tall figure in a dark suit appeared to be partially concealed behind a brick pillar. The man held what looked like a briefcase or folder. Most disturbing was the fact that he, too, was looking directly at Margaret and David. Sarah rubbed her eyes, thinking perhaps the long hours were affecting her vision. But no, the figure was clearly there, unmistakable once you knew where to look. A wave of excitement swept through her. She had just discovered something that had remained hidden for 70 years. The following week, Sarah immersed herself completely in researching Millfield's 1954 archives. What she had discovered in the photograph consumed her thoughts entirely. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something historically significant, something deliberately concealed for 7 decades. She canceled all her scheduled meetings and spent entire days in the Smithsonian's research vaults, surrounded by boxes of documents and yellowed newspaper clippings in the town's official records. She found Margaret Thompson's basic information: housewife, married to Robert Thompson, a factory supervisor, devoted mother, active in local church activities. Nothing unusual appeared in her standard biographical file. But Sarah knew from her extensive experience studying Cold War America that official records often concealed more than they revealed, especially during the era of McCarthyism and communist paranoia. She began searching through FBI files that had been declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. Access to these documents required special clearance. But her position as a senior Smithsonian researcher opened doors that remained closed to most historians. After hours of methodical searching through countless surveillance files, she finally found a thin folder labeled Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, Subject of Interest. The contents made her blood run cold. Subject under discreet surveillance: suspected communist sympathizer, possible courier for subversive materials, Agent Johnson monitoring since March 1954, behavioral analysis, unusual meeting patterns, unexplained absences from normal routine, access to sensitive factory information through spouse. Sarah's heart raced as she read. That shadowy figure in the photograph wasn't a random passerby. He was an FBI agent conducting surveillance on Margaret. But why? What was this seemingly ordinary American housewife hiding as she walked with her child on that spring afternoon? Her investigation intensified dramatically. Sarah discovered that Margaret's husband, Robert, worked as a supervisor at Millfield Manufacturing, a company holding several government contracts to produce components used in military equipment. Margaret herself volunteered at the local library and occasionally helped with bookkeeping at her husband's factory. The FBI file noted with suspicion: subject has irregular access to production schedules and shipping manifests. Frequent late-evening library visits coincide with scheduled meetings of suspected communist cell, determined to uncover the complete truth. Sarah began an intensive search for the Thompson family's descendants. After a week of genealogical research and phone calls across multiple states, she located David Thompson, now a 77-year-old retired engineer living in Portland, Oregon. His name appeared in veteran records and Social Security databases. What intrigued Sarah most was discovering his mother's maiden name, Margaret Elizabeth Kowalski, in immigration records from the 1920s, suggesting possible Eastern European connections. When Sarah contacted David by phone and carefully explained her research into the 1954 photograph and the mysterious figure in the background, a profound silence fell over the line, stretching into what felt like an eternity. "Dr. Mitchell," David finally said, his aged voice heavy with emotion, "I've been waiting for this call my entire life. I always knew that someday someone would piece together the truth about my mother. I've kept her secrets for 70 years, hoping that one day America would be ready to understand what really happened." During those terrifying times, Sarah felt an electric chill of anticipation and immediately booked a flight to Portland for a face-to-face interview, sensing she was on the verge of a major historical breakthrough. David lived in a comfortable suburban home filled with memorabilia from two distinctly different eras: his childhood in 1950s Ohio and his later successful career in aerospace engineering. The walls displayed family photographs that seemed to tell two separate stories, one of typical American prosperity, the other hinting at hidden struggles and secrets. When Sarah showed him the enhanced digital image on her laptop, zooming in on the FBI agent lurking in the shadows, the elderly man's eyes filled with tears. His weathered hands shook as he reached toward the screen, as if trying to touch a ghost from his past. "You can see him there, can't you?" Sarah asked gently, offering David a tissue. He nodded through his tears. Agent Richard Johnson. I remember him clearly now. He followed us everywhere for months. My mother knew he was watching. That's exactly why she's looking in his direction in that photograph. That particular day, we were heading to what she told me would be our last delivery before everything changed forever. Last delivery? Sarah asked, her breath catching as she sensed they were approaching a revelation that would rewrite local history. My mother was a courier in an underground network that helped people escape McCarthyism, persecution. David continued, his voice growing stronger as painful memories surfaced. She transported documents, messages, and sometimes even helped entire families disappear when they were about to be blacklisted or imprisoned for their political beliefs. That day, in the photograph, we were carrying what she said was the final package before we ourselves had to disappear from Millfield forever. I was just a 7-year-old kid. I thought we were simply running errands, but she knew our lives were in mortal danger. David's revelations opened an entirely unknown chapter of Millfield's Cold War history. Margaret Thompson wasn't just an ordinary housewife. She was a key figure in a sophisticated resistance network operating throughout the industrial Midwest. The organization she belonged to helped academics, union organizers, civil rights activists, and suspected communist sympathizers escape the increasingly paranoid witch hunts that were destroying lives across America during the McCarthy era. My mother was incredibly intelligent and resourceful. David recounted, his voice filled with both pride and lingering pain. She used her volunteer work at the library and her occasional access to the factory through my father's position to gather information about government investigations and planned arrests. She would make copies of FBI visit schedules, lists of people under surveillance, and shipping records that revealed which companies were cooperating with federal investigations. This intelligence was invaluable to people trying to stay one step ahead of the authorities. Sarah listened with growing amazement, realizing she had uncovered a story with profound implications for understanding grassroots resistance during one of America's darkest periods. She began to grasp that the photograph had captured one of the most dangerous moments in Margaret's clandestine career. On that specific day in April, David continued, his emotions intensifying. Mother was delivering a package to Henderson's bookstore that contained forged identification papers and travel documents for a family of university professors who were about to be arrested. Agent Johnson had been closing in on our network for weeks, but he still didn't have concrete evidence of criminal activity. He knew Mother was involved in something subversive, but he couldn't prove it. The elderly man slowly stood and retrieved a small, locked metal box from a bedroom closet, one that had clearly been hidden for decades. After we escaped to California, Mother made me promise to keep these documents safe. She said that someday, when the hysteria finally ended, people would need to know the truth about what really happened to ordinary Americans who dared to stand up for their neighbors. The documents preserved in David's box revealed an intricate escape operation planned with military precision over several months. Margaret collaborated with a nationwide underground railroad that helped political refugees relocate to safer regions of the country or flee to Canada or Mexico. The plan for the Thompson family involved a complex series of movements designed to completely erase their identities and establish new lives on the West Coast. On the day of that photograph, David explained, his voice trembling as he handled yellowed papers and faded identification cards. Mother and I were supposed to make our final contact at Henderson's bookstore. The owner, Mrs. Elenia Henderson, was a crucial part of our network. She had created a sophisticated system for hiding documents and people in her store's basement, which connected through old Prohibition-era tunnels to several other downtown buildings. The plan was for me to enter the bookstore first, pretending to browse children's books, while Mother followed to complete the document exchange with Mrs. Henderson. Sarah studied photocopied maps and handwritten notes detailing escape routes through multiple states. So, you were walking from your house on Elm Street directly to the bookstore in broad daylight. It had to look completely normal. David replied, tears forming in his eyes. But Mother knew we were being watched by more than just Agent Johnson. The FBI had deployed a full surveillance team that day because they suspected something big was about to happen. You can see the tension in her face in that photograph. She's constantly scanning for threats while trying to appear like a normal mother taking her son shopping. If everything had gone according to plan, we would have left Millfield that same night, beginning a journey that would eventually take us to Los Angeles, where new identities were waiting. Holding up a letter written in his mother's careful handwriting, David continued, his voice breaking, but nothing went according to plan that day. Agent Johnson wasn't working alone. He had positioned additional agents throughout downtown Millfield, including inside several stores. When Mother approached Henderson's bookstore, she immediately sensed the trap. That's when she made the split-second decision that saved both our lives, as Sarah's. Investigation deepened into previously classified materials. She discovered recently declassified FBI surveillance reports from that crucial day in April 1954. The documents, typed on official letterhead with clinical precision, revealed the federal government's systematic plan to capture Margaret Thompson and dismantled the entire underground network through arrests and interrogations, designed to terrorize others into compliance. Subject: Margaret Thompson will be maintained under close surveillance until she leads us to the complete network. Read Agent Johnson's report dated April 14, 1954. A coordinated team of 6 agents will be positioned throughout downtown Millfield tomorrow. We will not intervene until we have documented the full extent of her treasonous activities and identified all co-conspirators. Primary objective is the complete destruction of this subversive organization and the arrest of all participants for violation of the Smith Act and the Espionage Act of 1917. But something completely unexpected occurred that day, something that frustrated the FBI's carefully orchestrated operation. In subsequent reports, Agent Johnson wrote with obvious confusion and anger about the inexplicable disappearance of both surveillance targets. Subject and child entered Henderson's bookstore at approximately 2:45 p.m. Confirmed by agents positioned across the street and inside adjacent businesses. However, despite continuous monitoring of all exits, neither subject emerged from the store. A thorough search of the premises conducted at 4:30 p.m. revealed no trace of their presence. Possible escape route unknown. Sarah was astounded by these revelations. How had Margaret and David simply vanished from a building surrounded by federal agents? The answer came directly from David himself, whose childhood memories of that terrifying day remained crystal clear despite the passing decades. Mrs. Henderson had prepared for exactly this scenario. Her bookstore was connected to Millfield's old underground tunnel system, built during Prohibition for smuggling alcohol. When Mother saw FBI agents positioned around the building, she immediately activated the emergency protocol that had been rehearsed for months. David's voice grew quiet as he recalled those frightening moments. We entered the bookstore like normal customers, but Mrs. Henderson immediately guided us to a hidden door behind the history section. I was absolutely terrified and confused, but Mother remained incredibly calm and focused. She told me we were playing an exciting adventure game and that I needed to be brave and completely silent. No matter what happened next, the story of Margaret and David's escape from Millfield read like a thriller novel. But the stakes were devastatingly real for a mother trying to protect her child from government persecution. After entering the concealed tunnel system beneath Henderson's bookstore, they navigated a network of narrow passages that had been expertly maintained by the underground resistance. These tunnels connected several downtown buildings and ultimately led to the basement of Murphy's Pharmacy, where another network member, pharmacist, Dr. Patrick Murphy, waited with supplies for their complete transformation. Dr. Murphy had prepared detailed disguises for both of us. David recounted, his voice still filled with wonder at the elaborate operation. Mother was transformed into a traveling nurse, complete with authentic medical credentials and a realistic uniform. I became her young patient, with bandages and medical equipment that made me appear seriously ill. It was brilliant camouflage for the 1950s. No one questioned a medical professional. Transporting a sick child to a specialized hospital in another city. The deception was masterfully executed. Margaret and David emerged from the pharmacy through a rear entrance that opened onto a completely different street, where a pre-positioned automobile driven by another network member waited to transport them out of Ohio entirely, while Agent Johnson and his FBI team continued their fruitless surveillance of the bookstore. Their targets were already traveling along rural highways toward a safe house in Indiana. The journey to our first hiding place was absolutely terrifying for me, David remembered with visible emotion. Mother maintained her nurse persona perfectly, but I could feel her constant tension and fear. We stopped at several medical facilities along our route, which provided perfect cover for our movements. FBI roadblocks were set up throughout Ohio within hours of our disappearance, but no one suspected a nurse driving a sick child to seek specialized medical treatment. In Indiana, Margaret and David were sheltered by a cell of Quaker families who had been helping persecuted individuals for generations, drawing on their historical experience with the Underground Railroad that had once helped escaped slaves reach freedom. Mother gradually explained the truth about what was happening to us. David says, his eyes still reflecting the confusion of his 7-year-old self. She told me we could never return to our old life in Millfield, that we had to become completely different people in order to survive. For a young child, it was almost impossible to understand why we had to abandon everything familiar and begin again as strangers. Margaret and David successfully reached California in June 1954, after a harrowing cross-country journey that involved multiple identity changes and stays at safe houses operated by sympathetic families across the American West. They settled in Los Angeles under the names Mary and Daniel Mitchell, with carefully crafted documentation that established them as refugees from a factory accident in Ohio. Margaret found work as a seamstress in the garment district, while David enrolled in a local elementary school, where teachers were told he was recovering from trauma related to his father's workplace death. Mother never spoke publicly about our previous life in Ohio. David explains, his voice heavy with the weight of decades-long secrecy. She lived in constant fear that the FBI would eventually track us down, that our new identities would be discovered, and we would face imprisonment or worse. The paranoia of the McCarthy era followed us everywhere. She taught me never to mention Millfield, never to talk about our real family history, never to trust anyone completely with the truth about who we really were. Margaret Thompson, now living, as Mary Mitchell died in 1998 at the age of 74 in Los Angeles, having spent more than 4 decades looking over her shoulder and maintaining an elaborate fiction about her past. But before her death, she entrusted David with a collection of documents that told the complete story of their underground network and the dozens of families it had helped escape persecution. The box contained letters from other resistance members, photographs of secret meetings, copies of the forged documents they had used, and detailed accounts of FBI surveillance techniques. Mother hoped that someday historians would be able to tell the truth about what happened to ordinary Americans during the McCarthy era. David says, carefully handling the precious papers. She wanted people to understand that not everyone submitted to the hysteria, that some Americans risked everything to help their neighbors when the government turned against its own citizens. These documents prove that there was organized resistance to political persecution, even in small towns that seemed completely conformist. Sarah realized with growing excitement that she had uncovered not just one family's dramatic story, but evidence of a previously unknown nationwide network that helped hundreds of Americans escape McCarthyism. The Underground Railroad that saved Margaret and David was part of a sophisticated operation that challenged the official narrative of universal compliance during one of America's most repressive periods. That photograph, Sarah observed, studying. The image, again with new understanding, captured the exact moment when a mother made the impossible choice between staying in her homeland and saving her child from political persecution. It was a document of courage that remained hidden for 70 years. Sarah's exhaustive research culminated in a groundbreaking discovery that fundamentally altered historians' understanding of resistance during the McCarthy era. Through David's carefully preserved documents and recently declassified FBI files, she was able to reconstruct an entire network of ordinary Americans who had risked everything to protect their neighbors from political persecution. The Underground Railroad that saved the Thompson family had operated in at least 12 states and helped an estimated 300 families escape arrest, blacklisting, and imprisonment. Exactly 70 years after that historic photograph was taken, Sarah organized a major symposium at the Smithsonian Institution, where she presented her findings to a packed auditorium of historians, journalists, and civil rights advocates. The audience included several other families who had discovered their own hidden histories of resistance, as well as David Thompson making his first public appearance to discuss his mother's heroic activities. This seemingly innocent photograph, Sarah announced, displaying the enhanced image on a large screen, captures one of the most significant acts of courage in Millfield's history. Margaret Thompson and her son David weren't simply enjoying a spring afternoon. They were fleeing for their lives, carrying documents that could have exposed an entire OTA network dedicated to protecting constitutional rights when the government abandoned them. A profound silence filled the auditorium as the implications sank in. Many Americans had heard vague family stories about relatives who had moved away during the 1950s. But few had understood the systematic persecution that drove families into hiding. The photograph became a powerful symbol of resistance that had operated in plain sight, unrecognized by historians for 7 decades. Today, in downtown Millfield, Ohio, a bronze plaque marks the site of the former Henderson's bookstore, with Margaret and David's photograph prominently displayed. The inscription reads, "In honor of those who chose conscience over conformity. Margaret Thompson and the Underground Railroad of the McCarthy era, 1952 to 1956. Their courage reminds us that ordinary citizens can resist extraordinary injustice." David Thompson, now 77 years old, stood before the memorial during its dedication ceremony with tears streaming down his face. "My mother would be amazed to know that her secret has finally become a source of pride rather than shame." That photograph preserves forever the moment when we chose hope over fear, when we decided that America's true values were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The discovery has inspired dozens of other families to come forward with their own hidden stories, revealing that resistance to McCarthyism was far more widespread than previously understood. Margaret Thompson's courage has become a symbol of the ordinary Americans who refused to surrender their principles during one of the nation's darkest chapters.